Hi everyone, it's another week and we are again back with another useful quick tip brought to you by dataplatformcentral.com. So in this week we are going to look into a latest enhancement which got released in Azure Data Factory recently. Previously we had a look at one of the cool features which came in the latest update of Power BI. Similar to that, we have a very useful feature which is currently introduced in Azure Data Factory, which is known as the reusable data flows, or the short name for them is Flowlets. Flowlets provide us with a means to create reusable data flow artifacts which can be shared across multiple data flow components. So let's see how we can define a flowlet and use it within multiple data flows or within the same data flow under multiple execution trees. Flowlets presents a part of a data flow which includes any useful logic which can be reused across multiple data flows. So if you consider this analogous to SQL, this is like the user defined functions or UDFs in SQL. So you can create your customized logic as a flowlet inside Azure Data Factory, and once the logic is created, the logic can be reused inside multiple data flows. So in our example that we are going to see, we are going to create a flowlet which will perform a very simple operation which is deduplication of data, and we will be reusing this flowlet inside multiple data flow execution trees which corresponds to data coming from multiple sources, and then we will be applying this dedupe logic on top of them so as to remove the duplicates from the data, and finally we will be using the data processing. So let's go straight into our demonstration and see how a flowlet can be created and how it can be reused inside multiple execution paths. For the sake of this demo, we will be using some order related data, and we have two sheets, one an Excel sheet and another one a CSV sheet which consists of these order details. Part of this order details represents online orders which the customers places through website, and in this case if you see the data entity, we have the order ID, the customer name, the order date, order total, shipped date and delivery date as the columns which is coming from a website. So for simplicity, I am representing the data inside an Excel sheet, whereas in the actual case this might come from one of your transactional databases. And the second part of the order represents the store orders, where people come to the store and purchase goods. So we have represented this for the demonstration inside a CSV file. The difference between these two data entities is that for in-store orders, they have an additional column in this case, which is called the sales advisor, which represents the lead through which the sales got materialized. So you'll have the different sales advisors who will be attending you when you visit the shop so as to help you with your sales. So of course the sales advisors will be given commissions based on their performance, so that information will also be captured for the case of store orders. So these are the two different data entities that we have with a slight difference. In the actual case you may have more columns which are related to the orders, but for simplicity we are just representing them using these two simple data entities. So we have the data coming from Excel sheet in one case and CSV in the other case, whereas in the actual case this might come from completely different systems. One might be the system which is associated with the e-com, whereas the other might come from a POS system in the actual case. So let's see how we apply the deduplication logic to each one of these data inside ADF. So we'll be creating a flowlet for that, and we'll be creating separate data flows which will process the data coming from e-com system as well as the POS system. So in this case the Excel sheet as well as the CSV, and then we can see how we can achieve this deduplication by applying this flowlet logic. So this gives an excellent example of reusing the same logic inside multiple data flows. So let's see how we can do that. So for that purpose, let's first go to the Azure portal. In Azure portal I have a storage account which is maintained, and I have two containers inside that, and one of this container contains the e-com orders which is the Excel sheet, and the second container contains the store orders. So we will be picking up the data from these storage containers, and then we will be processing it through a ADF package utilizing the Flowlet logic, and finally we will be dumping it into a Azure SQL database. So I have created an Azure SQL database for this purpose, and I have a table called order setup which will be having the data coming from both these systems, and I have added one more column inside that table so as to identify the type of orders, whether it is for e-com order or whether it represents a store order. So let's see how we can create the package now. So as to process these two data and push the data into the common table that we have maintained inside Azure SQL database. For this purpose, let's first go to the Azure Data Factory. Let's go to the home page of the Azure Data Factory from your Azure portal, and let's go to the Author tab. This is where we'll be creating the new Flowlet as well as the data flows which will be utilizing this Flowlets. So let's first go to the plus icon, and we can find this new Flowlet item under data flow. So under data flow you can see that there is also a data flow and the new feature which is known as the Flowlet. So now we will be creating the Flowlet first. So let's click on Flowlet, and we can enable the data flow debug also, so that we can debug it as we go and make sure that the data is correct before we actually run the full package as a whole. So the first thing is to add an input. So when you create a Flowlet, you have to define an input for the Flowlet, and either it can point to a source or it can point to a generic input. So here we don't know the source, and in our actual case the data comes from different sources. The store orders comes from a CSV, and the e-com orders comes from an Excel sheet. So in that case, it's always best to set a generic input rather than setting it to a particular source. So maybe in one case, one set of data might come from a relational database, whereas the other set of data will come from a different system. So as to make it generic, we can always define a generic input for our Flowlet so that it can work with any different types of sources which is a part of the ADF pipeline. So we have defined this generic input, and because we are defining the generic input, we need to define the complete metadata as well, which means the columns. So here we will be defining the complete metadata. Now if you compare your two files, you can see that there is a small difference in metadata. One of the file, that is the store orders, contains the additional column called sales advisor. So when you define a Flowlet, you need to make sure that it includes all the columns as it comes from your source systems, even if one of the sources is missing a column. So while we call this Flowlet, then we will make sure that we are passing some default values for these columns which are not coming from any particular type of sources. So what we need to do here is that we need to define the entire set of columns. So let's start defining them one by one. So now we have defined all the columns inside our Flowlet as coming from both the files. So if you see, we have the order ID, the customer name, order date, order total, ship date, delivery date, and sales advisor. So if you see both the files, these files contains these columns. Even if the column is missing from one of the files, for example sales advisor, we need to include it within our Flowlet as specified earlier. So now that we have defined the columns inside, now let's define the actual logic that we are going to put inside Flowlet. So here we are going to do a deduplication of data. So for that purpose, what we need to do is like we have multiple entries for the same customer, and we are going to return only the latest order corresponding to each of those customers to our system as a part of this demonstration. So for that purpose, we need to first define two outputs. So for that purpose, we are going to use a conditional split, and we will be defining two trivial outputs on this. Both of them will contain the same set of rows. We are basically cloning the input data into two outputs so that one can be aggregated and joined to the other so as to remove the duplicate. So what we do is like we'll aggregate one input, and we'll be getting the unique combinations based on customer name, and we'll be getting the latest date, and using that we'll be joining it to the other input so as to get only the latest entry corresponding to each of the customers, and then finally we will return it to the output flow. So let's see how we can do that. We'll just define two outputs. So we are going to click on all matching conditions because we need to get all the rows on both the outputs, and we'll be defining two outputs. One would be OP1 and the next output will be OP2, and we are going to remove the default output. We don't need that because we are going to just clone the incoming stream onto two output streams, and here both the cases we will just put a trivial expression. So we will be using just a trivial expression like true equal to true, which is always going to be true for all the rows, which means the entire incoming rows will go through both the outputs. So this is as good as cloning the input, and we are deleting the default output. So if there are 1000 rows coming from the input, both of the outputs will contain all the 1000 rows. So for the first output, we are going to aggregate it. So let's select aggregate, and inside aggregate we have the group by and the aggregate. So in the group by we need to select customer name, because we are going to get the unique combination based on customer name. And for the aggregates, we are just going to take the maximum of the date. So let's select order date here, and we are going to apply a maximum over the date column so as to get the latest date. And this we'll be using for joining to the main input data so as to get the latest entry corresponding to each of these customers. So we'll be using max function for this purpose, and inside that we'll be selecting the date column. So this will ensure that we'll get a maximum order date corresponding to each of those customers so as to pick out the latest order. So now that the aggregate is ready, now let's go to the second output, and we are going to join that output data to this aggregated data. So let's select a join from here, and we'll be selecting an inner join because it has to be a perfect match. And for the join condition, we are going to select customer name equal to customer name, and for the right stream we need to select aggregate output. So customer name from here should match the customer name from the aggregate, and the second condition would be the order date from here should match to the order date which is coming from aggregate. So this will pick out the latest orders. And then now we have the join condition available, which will only have the unique records based on the customer name, which will correspond to the latest order for each of those customers. So from this join, so if you see the join output, we can see that there are two columns which are repeated, which corresponds to the customer name and the order date, because they come from the aggregate as well as from the conditional split output. But we don't require these aggregate columns because that is just for removing the duplicates. So we need to select only the required columns. For that purpose, let's select the select activity, and inside the select activity, let's remove the unwanted columns, that is the columns which are coming from aggregate. We need only the columns which are coming from the conditional split output, which is the order date, customer ID, the order total, and all the other columns. And once we are done with that, then we can link it to the output, the generic column. And here you just can put the default mapping itself, and you can just check that the column names are correct from order ID till sales advisor. So now that we have set up the Flowlet, let's publish it. The Flowlet is now published. So now we are ready to use this Flowlet inside our multiple data flow tasks so as to remove the duplicates for the store as well as the e-commerce orders. The next part of the demo, we are going to create a pipeline with two data flows where we will be using this Flowlet for performing the deduplication of data which comes from both of our sources. So let's first go and create the new pipeline. Let's go to pipeline, the new pipeline option, and it will automatically visualize a new pipeline object for us. And inside that, we can first go and add a data flow component. So in this case, we are going to first pull the data from e-com orders, and then we'll add a separate data flow for getting the data from store orders. So inside the data flow, let's instantiate a data flow. Going to the settings and clicking on new, we'll be creating a new data flow. And once the data flow is created, the first step would be to add the source. So in our case, because it comes from e-com orders, we'll be clicking on add source step, and inside that we need to create a new linked service. Now currently our Excel file resides inside an Azure Data Lake storage container. So we need to choose Azure Blob Storage. Click on continue, and in this case the file is going to be an Excel file. Again click on continue, and we are going to initialize a new linked service, and we can just pass in, because it is within the same subscription, we can choose the subscription, choose the account name, it's inside this in ACCT storage, and then we can connect to this by testing connection. And once the linked service is created, now let's go inside the corresponding container. So our files are inside a container called e-com orders. So let's go inside e-com orders, and you can see the Excel file inside that. So you can select the Excel file because it's a single Excel file in this demonstration, but there in the actual case, if you have multiple files, you can select the folder itself so that it iterates through each file inside. So in our case, we have a single file, so we are just pointing it. And inside the sheet name, just select the sheet which contains your data, which is e-com orders, and of course the first row would be the header for us, so we need to set that particular setting and click on OK. So it will pull all the metadata from the Excel sheet available. So once it's connected, you can go and check the projection, and it will show all the columns which are coming from your Excel sheet. So it will contain order ID, customer name, order date, order total, ship date and delivery date. Because it's a e-com orders, we don't have the sales advisor here. Sales advisor will be only there for the storers. Now what we need to do is that before we connect it to the Flowlet, we need to make sure that the data types of the columns as well as the format are in accordance with what the file contains. Otherwise it will not be able to parse the data properly. So now if you see, it is taking order ID, everything will be taken as string by default. We need to change it to the corresponding data type. So order ID would be an integer, customer name would be a string itself, so we can leave it as it is. Order date would be a date, and you need to specify the format here because it's an Excel. The date would be in DD format, so you can select DD format, and order total will be double, and you can choose a corresponding format from there. You can choose a format like we want up to 2 decimal places, so you can put up to 2 decimal places and up to 4 digits before decimal place, because our value lies between 1000. So depending on your value, you can set the corresponding format. And ship date will again be a date, and there also if you see the format, it would be DD, and again for the delivery date also it will be a date format. So what you can do is like you can try parsing it using different formats if you are unsure of what format in which your data is coming. And once you go to the preview tab, you'll be able to see the data. If your format is correct, it will be able to parse the data and show you. Otherwise it will just return you null value. So now if you go to the inspect, you can see that the columns that you have set, order ID, customer ID, so that you can just double check that all the columns are coming. Go to the data preview and then turn on your data flow debug so that the debugging clusters are ready. Once the debugging clusters are ready, you can refresh and see whether the data is coming as per your expectation. As the debugging clusters are ready, you can click on refresh and make sure that you are able to see the data as per what is coming from your files. So if you are able to see all the date values, the decimal values and everything correctly, then it means that the format that you have set as well as the data types are correct. So as you see here, it's able to parse all your dates properly as well as the order total. So that means it's working fine. Now if you remember, the e-com orders doesn't have some columns which are expected by the Flowlet. So if you remember, the Flowlet has an additional column called sales advisor. This column is missing from e-com orders because there is no sales advisor for e-com orders. So we need to ensure that we are adding that column with the default value before we point it to the Flowlet. So go back to your data flow and you need to add a derived column. So go back to your data flow, and in the data flow you need to add a derived column. And in the derived column you will be adding the new column which is missing from your table, which is the sales advisor column. So we have now added the new column called sales advisor and we'll set it to null. It's just a default value. So now that we have all the columns which are required for the Flowlet, we can now add the Flowlet object. So click on the plus icon at the end of the derived column so as to add the Flowlet to its output. And the Flowlet that we'll be selecting will be the Flowlet called Flowlet 2, which we created in the last step. Now if you go to the mapping, you can see all the columns inside the Flowlet, and automatically the columns in your current data flow will be mapped based on the names. In case one or more of the columns have a different name, you have to map it manually, but in this case, because we are using the same names, they will all be auto-mapped. Now if you want to see the output, you can go to the data preview and you can click on refresh, and after a while you should see the output as it is given by the Flowlet. And if you check that, you can find that the duplicates would have been removed by now, but anyways we'll be checking them after we insert it to the destination table. So now you can see the output as it comes from your Flowlet, and you can see that everything is coming fine except sales advisor, which has the default value that you have set, which is the null value. So now you have got the output from the Flowlet. Now we need to add one more column which is for adding the type of the order. So you can add that order type column also in the end, because that is one of the column which is there in your destination table, and you will set it to a constant value of e-com orders in this case, and in the next case we will set it to sales orders. So set it to a constant value of e-com orders, and now you have all the columns available for your destination table. So you can click on the sync. Now click on sync and you can click on new dataset, and in this case we are pointing to the Azure SQL database. So click on continue and make sure that you create a new linked service and you select your subscription. Select the server name that we have, Azure SQL Server, and also the Azure SQL database that we created, and the username and the password should be entered. And now click on test connection and make sure that the connection is successful. And once the connection is successful, you can go and point to your table. So in this case, our table is called dbo.orders. So you can click on dbo.orders and click on OK. And in the next tab, you will have the mappings. So once that the table is mapped, you can go to the mapping tables, and the mapping tab will have auto mapping, which means the columns will be mapped based on the names. If you want to see the columns, you can just disable it for the timing and you will see all the columns there. And you can see that there is a column sales advisor not properly mapped, so you can map it manually. Because the column in our data flow says sales advisor, the table has only sale advisor. As it tries to compare using the name, it can't find the corresponding column. That's why it was not mapped. Now you map it manually, and now if you go to the data preview and again refresh it, you should be able to see the preview of the data as it comes from the Flowlet output after adding that additional column, which is the order type column, which will have the constant value of e-com orders. So you can just verify the output once and make sure that everything is fine. Now the first data flow is done. Now we need to do the same steps for creating the second data flow, but in that case we will be pointing to the CSV file, which is inside another container and which corresponds to the store orders. There we will have the additional column sales advisor coming from the files. So let's go ahead and create that. So let's add one more data flow to this, and let's add a new data flow object, and here we are going to point to the CSV files. So once you complete that, the data flow will correspond to exactly the same as your earlier data flow. The only difference being the format of the dates will be different in source, and when you come to the Flowlet, because the data, the sales advisor data is already coming in the data, you don't require that additional derived column in between to include the default value. Instead of that, you can directly map it to the Flowlet. And in the second derived flow column, instead of adding e-com orders, we will name it store orders. And in the final sync also, you can see that it gets mapped correctly, except for that sales advisor column, which you have to map manually because of the difference in the name. So once you are done with all these things, you can go back to your pipeline and you can add one data flow to another if you want to execute them sequentially. And then you can click on validate and make sure that everything is success. And now you can publish it. All your changes which you have added, including the linked services, the data flow, the Flowlet, the pipeline, everything will be published. Once you see the publishing is completed successfully, message inside your notification, you can now go to the pipeline and click on trigger now to start executing the package. And once the package is done, you can go and check the results inside your table, and you should see the data being loaded into the table from e-com as well as from store orders after removing the duplicates. Keep refreshing the monitor tab until you see both of the data flows being executed. Now that both the data flows are executed, you can go back and check your table for your results. So before you check the table, first go to one of your files, make sure that you sort it by means of customer name so that you can find out the duplicates. So if you see e-com orders, you can see a customer called Crystal Gent who has multiple orders. So you can take that as an example and check it against your table to make sure that there is no duplicate present inside your table. So this is an e-com order. So let's go to the table name, which is the order table. So select star from table where customer name equal to your customer and order type equal to e-com orders. This will give you only one order, indicating that the deduplication was a success. So you see there is only a single order currently present in your table for Crystal Gent, and if you see the order, that is actually the order corresponding to the order date of 13/8/2021. If you compare it to your file has two orders, one 13/8 and one on 29/5. So the latest order is on 13/8 and the order number is 168. That's the same order that you will get in your table, which indicates that the Flowlet only extracted the latest order for every customer. Similarly, you can also have a look at a total data inside the table by grouping it based on customer name. There is not even a single instance of customer which is having duplicate orders. This shows how you can make use of a Flowlet so as to reuse the logic inside multiple data flows, so that You can share it across multiple data flows or even inside the same data flow in multiple execution paths. So it becomes really handy for the developers to reuse a bit of logic, especially when the logic involved is a complicated one, inside multiple execution paths or multiple data flows. So in a way, Flowlet helps us to reduce our development effort. So as you saw from our quick demo, the Flowlets are a very useful feature which can be used inside your data flows so as to group your reusable logic, and the Flowlets can be invoked inside multiple data flows so as to implement the logic instead of writing the code each time. This saves a lot of development effort. As usual, keep sending your feedback and let me know your comments. Feel free to follow my channel for getting useful tips like this, and press the bell icon for getting notifications. Meet you all soon with another useful quick tip like this next week. Till then, bye and thanks for it.